Is this Baked Alaska calling in from New York? Like the Baked Alaska?
not the one. If you're thinking of the infamous streamer Baked Alaska.
Okay. Because I kind of freaked out for a little bit there. I was like, is Baked Alaska actually calling into Truth Wanted right now? But I guess it's a different Baked Alaska. Okay. Whew. Gave me a fucking heart attack there, dude. What the fuck?
It's my favorite dessert. In fact, I never would have picked this username if I had known about that individual. But it is my favorite ice cream, and so I've just stuck with it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's Baked Alaska. For those of you who don't know, that's a whole other story. But if you want to know about like very big anti-Semitic people on the internet right now, like doing crazy stuff, like go look up Baked Alaska, because that's a whole other thing. But anyway, other Baked Alaska, what do you got for us today?
Yeah, what's up, man? So I've been engaging with some of the wise souls in your chat, as I often do when I listen to the show. I always enjoy listening in and engaging with the people in the chat. There tends to be sometimes this thread, and I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are on it, that basically theists don't have any evidence for God's existence. A lot of people seem to take that view. I think it's patently false and absurd, but I'm kind of curious what you guys think. Do you guys agree with some of the more hardliners in the chat, or do you think there are some good reasons for believing, but you're just not convinced?
So I'm hearing two different things here, just to clarify. There's good reasons to believe, and there's evidence. I would say those are two different things, in my point of view. I would say there's evidence, for sure. Are there good reasons to believe, though? I think that's different. I think there are certainly reasons to believe. I'm not sure if I would evaluate them as good, if that makes sense. Now, the reason why I say there's evidence is because I think if you're to make certain apologetic arguments towards the existence of God, and even Christian God or any other kinds of God, there are going to be things that you can consider as evidence. And I'm totally okay with that. But we can evaluate evidence in different ways, right? And there may be other kinds of evidence that can counteract other evidence, right? Like you can have one study that says one thing and 10 other studies that say a different thing, and they might both be evidence towards different things, but the evidence for one claim might be better overall than another one. Now, how we evaluate it, what are the methods we use? I mean, that's philosophy, right? That's philosophy of science, but that's a whole debate. So it's the question of, is there evidence for God? Potentially, I think evidence is there, but I don't know if it's good evidence, if that makes sense. So very, very careful in my word choice. But that's my take. Zod, what do you think?
To me, this question, unless we're more specific, is probably going to drill down to a level of semantics I'm not super interested in. To me, when somebody says there is evidence for something, that usually connotes something along the line of hard evidence, or something that you can show somebody that indicates something is real. I don't see that for Christianity. I don't see anything that gives me a good reason to believe. So aside from splitting hairs over exactly what evidence is and whether there's good or bad evidence, I would say no, in the sense that I don't find it compelling, but I don't know that means that you can conclusively say there's nothing that can be called evidence. Once you get down to that fine of a point, don't find the question that interesting. So I would suspect that most people in the chat, if they're telling you there is no evidence for Christianity, they probably mean, even if they're being imprecise with their language, that they don't find compelling reason to believe in it. They're not saying conclusively there's no kind of argument, there's no kind of indication that a Christian can take to justify their belief, just that it's not evidence in the way that most of us think of evidence when we think of a compelling reason to believe in something.
Yeah.
I don't know. It might have been long-winded, but this is a little bit of a fine-toothed question. And unless there was an example of something you were referring to. Go ahead.
So I actually agree with both of you, and I think that's a very reasonable stance. I think, however, though, that, and I'm not being contrarian, I think the position that some people take is there is no evidence. They're not. See, the way I've gone back and forth like over the years. Like I was raised Christian, and then as I got older, I sort of became agnostic and almost I would say atheist at some point, and then came back. You know, like most people do. Like you kind of go in these circles in terms of your belief. And what did it for me in part was like weighing what I thought were the arguments, weighing what I thought the evidence is. And I think there is evidence on both sides. I think the atheist is rational, right? But I hear a lot of times like atheists say like being a theist is irrational, right? And to me, like that's an irrational position, right? And I think some atheists take the position like there is no evidence for God. Like it's this like, you know, pixies, it's this imaginary character in the sky. You have absolutely no evidence for it at all. Everything, the Bible, the whole thing's a made up book, right? You'll hear claims are not evidence, right? Which obviously they are. Like if someone is making a claim, it is a form of testimonial evidence. Now you may not think it's strong evidence. It may not count for barely anything, but we would generally consider that to be evidence because it has some tendency of making some fact of consequence more or less, you know, likely to be true or not. So yeah, it is semantics on some level, but I think this is where the debate, like when you get into the debate with a lot of people, this is where the debate actually, like this is what actually he ends up debating with people, where they're like, no, you don't have anything, you know?
Couple things I have. One, I just want to clarify something, and that one, we're always going to be defining words however we want to define them, right? So like there's always going to be some, especially in philosophy, like ask 10 philosophers what rational means and you're probably going to get 10 maybe very similar but different answers, right? Like there's, even in the subject of philosophy, there's not true universal definitions for what even the most basic terms mean. And that's just, I don't know, I guess that's just part of being human. Sartre would say it's because, you know, the language is all that we have and it doesn't actually universally signify anything. There is no universe. But postmodernism aside, the point is, right, when we're talking about like specific things like using claim, right, claim versus a testimony could be evidence, but a claim may not actually be evidence, right? If I have testimony that I saw Zod murdered somebody, that is evidence, right? But if I say there's an invisible teapot on Mars and I'm just making a claim, that's not a testimony, right? I didn't see anything to it. I'm not attesting to the account of it. I'm just saying it, right? So like even then there's some semantic stuff that is important. But again, I do go back to this idea that, look, evidence may be there if you interpret certain claims. You can find evidence for claims. It's my position is just, well, if we look at the aggregate sum of the world and our experiences and what we can observe and measure, I think it points to claims that don't endorse theism in really any recognizable way, right? That's really how I think about this stuff. I just don't think the evidence points to theism as a whole. But you know,
that's part of why. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I totally get that view, right? The debate I'm having with the chat, and as we're talking, I'm seeing that some of them are saying, like, where's your evidence, right? Because they want me to now get into the substance and provide the actual, like, meat and potatoes. And I've avoided doing that because I wanted to hear what your guys' higher level view of it was, right? Because it seems to me you guys are agreeing with me. There is what you would, forget the semantics, what is colloquially known as evidence or reasons for believing something. You do agree that there is some of that there in support of theism, right? And
well, no, there's the distinction. I don't think it's in support of theism.
Yeah,
that's the difference. Just because there's evidence doesn't mean it's in support. In the legal process, right? You go through discovery. You go through the exchange of evidence. That doesn't mean it supports one thing or the other. It's just what's going to be used, in discussion, right? So yes, there's evidence. No, I don't think it supports theism. That's
why I find these kinds of discussions very uninteresting and possibly counterproductive, because you can whittle your way down to some kind of semantic admission that there is something called evidence. But when you say there's evidence for Christianity, that connotes something entirely different.
Yeah.
And so when you work your way down to that admission and then start using language that way, I feel like theists like to fight these battles over semantics. And this might sound a little accusatory, but there's a tendency to want to do this, to fight your way down to some kind of semantic victory over the meaning of a word. And then can you using a word that might be technically correct according to the admission you got out of somebody, but then that connotes something completely different. And that's what I think we're seeing unfold in this conversation. We're already running into confusion. Just to clarify,
this would be a pyrrhic victory. This would be a pyrrhic victory for me. I would win nothing by you guys conceding this point, because I think I think it's absurd to suggest the opposite, right? Because I'm already saying, like, I think being an atheist is rational. Like, you're totally justified and rational being an atheist, right? But I'm just saying the opposite isn't true. And that's what I'm taking objection with, right? It's so often presented that way. And ironically, and here's what I find really ironic. A lot of the people who make that claim to be the type of atheists where they're like, well, I just withhold belief in God. I'm not really like a strong atheist making the claim that there is no God. I just lack the belief that there is a God. So it's like, on one hand, they're saying I'm irrational for being a theist or for thinking there's any evidence at all. But on the other hand, they're like, but I'm just withholding belief. You know, I'm not saying one thing or the other. I'm not taking the position that there is a God.
So what?
It's totally inconsistent. How can you hold both of those?
Go ahead, Zod.
To clarify my point, I'm not trying to say that you're trying to win a specific victory. I don't think this is all conscious, and I don't think this is all done with a specific end goal in mind. But what I think results regardless is that there ends up being a certain amount of confusion over the word, and it ends up being used in a certain way that as we saw in this conversation, that already created some confusion over whether Dan and I admitted that the word evidence could be used in a certain way versus if we thought that evidence spoke in favor of theism, which I absolutely do not think it does. So I like to just completely back out of the weeds on this and quit trying to distinguish between whether people think there's good reason to believe in theism or whether there's any evidence for theism, which again, we're already bouncing back and forth between these two different things that people could mean. And so you end up chasing your tail in circles over the precise meanings of words. And I already hear you during this call constantly correcting yourself over what the chat actually meant when they were telling you things. And those are very substantially different things. And so it just creates a ton of confusion. So I like to back out of it completely, treat Christianity like I would treat any other claim about a ghost or a vampire or a UFO or anything else like that, or whatever the term is for the flying saucers now, and just say, I don't see compelling reason to believe in it. The reason we go down this rabbit hole so far is because Christianity is a bigger, more prominent supernatural paranormal claim in our society. And so we end up picking through the precise language of how we doubt. Versus with vampires, I'm allowed to just be satisfied with the fact that I don't believe and I don't see good reason to believe in it. Yeah. And so I want the freedom to do that with Christianity without getting mired down into the weeds of exactly whether I see what can be categorized as some form of evidence or whatever. I just find that uninteresting and counterproductive. That's all I have to say.
And I, just to say a few more words on this, rationality is also, again, another word that we might contest to, because you're saying there are people that call Christianity irrational. And I would say, by a certain definition, you can still say irrational if rationality is, if we're defining it as comporting to logic, right? I could still say it's still illogical, it's still irrational, and that would be my point of view. It doesn't mean that it's, the objective truth, but I don't think people are necessarily wrong if they're saying, from my point of view, this is irrational, right? But I also don't actually have too much of a problem when people take the lack theist point of view that you pointed out, which is a withholding of belief from God. Obviously, in proper philosophical circles, this isn't that hasn't been the norm for atheism, right? This is why there's a big debate on what atheism actually means. Is it the withholding of the belief, or is it the positive claim that there are no gods? Historically, for a lot of atheist literature, it actually has meant the positive claim that there are no gods. So people have kind of come up with this way of saying, well, I just want to withhold belief. Some people say that isn't actually a philosophical proposition because it's more describing a psychological state. If that's true, then people still calling themselves atheists, all they're doing is describing a psychological state. There's nothing wrong with that. But it may give issues in how you analyze your logic. Point is, like, I want to try to listen to people with the words that they use and understand what they mean when they say the words that they use. Otherwise, we get into very long, drawn out debates about semantics here. But if you want my official take, is there evidence by some definitions of the word evidence? Yes. Do I think it supports theism though? Do I think a person who is clearly thinking is going to be able to come to the conclusion that theism is real based on the evidence that they would have available, at least the same evidence that I have access to? No, I don't think so. And maybe you have issues with that, but I don't know. That's my take. Baked Alaska, I'll let you comment on that before we let you go here.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that, Dan, and I think your ObjectivelyDan username is quite fitting because I think you do your best to be objective, and I'll actually take that as a win over exceptionally average in the chat, who is claiming that I would not be able to solicit any type of concessions from you guys if I called in. No, I'm being facetious. I know I totally get what you guys are saying. The only closing thoughts were just, I'll just keep it brief. Like, yeah, I think in terms of like analytical philosophy, like it is the positive claim that God does not exist, because otherwise, if it's just saying that you lack the belief in God, I mean, I could say I lack the belief that God does not exist, and what does that do, right? Like, how do we move forward in the conversation if we just both say we lack beliefs in these ontologically different things? So I think you need to make claims, and then I think you need to have like honest conversations, and weigh the reasons, weigh the rationales. I mean, I think it's absurd to compare God and metaphysical hypothesis to like aliens or Dracula or the other things that were mentioned that have absolutely no explanatory power scope from a metaphysical perspective. There's absolutely no reason to think those things exist.
I don't know.
Everybody feels that way about their specific paranormal claim.
Yeah. Actually, I actually totally disagree with you on that. I think there's definitely more reasons to think aliens exist than a lot of God concepts, right? I mean,
there's nothing out for an explanation. Like, so if we didn't observe UFOs, right?
We don't have time. I'm sorry, we don't have time. I know that there's ontological arguments for the existence of God, right? If we're talking about from a metaphysical perspective. And yeah, okay, maybe there could be, but there's also physical evidence to suggest aliens exist. And I'm not talking about like people that we can visit. I'm just talking about what we know about the universe and its formation and how we got here. We can at least imagine hypothetical possibilities that comport to a reality that aliens exist, right? Like you don't even have to use ontological arguments to go there. But look, I am serious though. I do have to let you go. I wanted to give you your piece on that. So thank you for calling in and discussing your point of view. And one last thing as well. I'm ObjectivelyDan. I'm not Objective Dan. It's a common misnomer. Okay, I don't make claims that I'm objective. That I think maybe I chose a bad username because I think that's what people think, and it sounds really pretentious, but it's just kind of a joke because like saying you're ObjectivelyDan doesn't really mean anything, and I just think it's funny.